So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Prakash Nagarkatti. Currently, he serves as the Senior Research Advisor to the President of the University of South Carolina and Carolina Distinguished Professor. In this capacity, he represents USC on Battelle Savannah River Alliance that manages $3.8 billion contract from the Department of Energy in the operation of Savannah River National Lab. From 2011 to 2021, he served as the Vice President for Research at USC, managing $280 million research enterprise. Currently, he also serves as the director of the NIH-funded CAM Center for Epigenetic Regulation of Inflammation, director of the NIH Cobre Center for the Dietary Supplements and Inflammation, and PDPI on NSF EPSCoR Track 1. Dr. Nagarkatti has published over 330 scientific papers and has mentored over 44 graduate students, 20 URM scholars, 29 postdocs, 35 junior faculty, and 36 international scholars. Dr. Nagarkatti currently serves as the chair of the National EPSCoR IDEA Foundation Board. He's a fellow of the AAAS, a fellow of the Academy of Toxicological Science, and a fellow of the National Academy of Inventors. He's active in communicating science to the public through the Conversation, BBC News, PBS documentary, and the USA Today COVID vaccine panel. So please welcome Dr. Nagarkatti.
Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you, Jose, for that nice introduction. My head is spinning, I'm sure, just like yours, with the excitement of these two new programs. So I don't know whether I'm able to even focus on my talk today, but nonetheless, I'll try my best. And if you all have any questions and want to interrupt me anytime, that's fine too as well. So I'm a recovering administrator. I've been in administration research for the last 40 years, out of which almost one half of that, 20 years, I spent in the state of Virginia, which is a non-EPSCoR, non-IDEA state. And I didn't realize there was this EPSCoR, non-EPSCoR kind of a thing. And then I moved almost 18 years ago to South Carolina, and I was the VPR there for almost 11 years. So I got to know the EPSCoR IDEA programs, and I began to realize, how moving from Virginia to South Carolina, the amount of resources that we had in the state of Virginia compared to amount of resources we had in the state of South Carolina, they were tremendously different. And therefore, I got more interested into the EPSCoR IDEA programs. And then I also happened to be the PI for Track 1 as well as for the COBRAs. And that's how I got more and more interested in the EPSCoR IDEA programs and what they have to offer. So today's talk, I'm going to be talking about the inequality that exists in federal research funding and how it impacts the EPSCoR IDEA states. I don't need to explain to this particular crowd, but that the universities are the drivers of the innovation economy in the United States. While all of you are aware of this, but not many in the public are aware of the fact that universities are the places where major innovations have occurred in the past as well as continue to occur. And that includes insulin, computers, algorithms for Google, FM radio, MRIs, GPS barcodes, and on, including the cures for childhood leukemia to jet fuel. So clearly, therefore, universities are basically the places where the innovation occurs, and that drives the regional, national, as well as the global economy. So the question, therefore, is, how do the universities support research and development, right? So where do they get their resources from? And if you look at basically the data that how is research supported at various universities, you'll find, or you'll be surprised to know that almost 85% of the research that is going on at university setting is supported by the federal agencies, and primarily the NIH and NSF. And less than 10% is supported from state and local resources as well as business industries as well. So which means to say that even if whether you're MIT or Johns Hopkins or Harvard, almost 80% or 85% of their funding comes from federal agencies. And the federal agencies clearly understand the importance of investing in research infrastructure as well as innovation in both basic and applied research, because they know that those are the that kind of support leads to innovations in the universities, and that translates into innovation-driven economy. Sorry. So the federal agencies contribute about $49 billion to support research across all universities, and we heard that in the morning talk as well. But if you look at the way that these funds are distributed across the 50 states, you'll realize on the left side you have California, New York, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Massachusetts, which together almost capture one half of those $49 billion. Almost $22 billion goes to support these 6 states. And then there are about 26 states which together generate less than 10 to 12%. For example, in state of South Carolina, we are sandwiched between North Carolina and Georgia on either side. North Carolina generates about $2 billion of federal research expenditures. Compare that to Georgia, about $1.8 billion, while South Carolina is generating only about $365 million. That makes it challenging because clearly the infrastructure in Georgia and North Carolina are so much better than what we have in state of South Carolina. So when we're trying to attract the faculty, when we are trying to attract graduate students or postdocs, it's going to be challenging for us in state of South Carolina. I'm sure you'll experience that similarly in your EPSCoR jurisdictions, because they would rather go to, either to Georgia or North Carolina because they have better research facilities, as well as, the environment is so much better for pursuing research. That's why we lose a lot of our students to our neighboring states. And the Congress has been aware of this beginning 1980s. That's why the Congress mandated that NSF should allocate small amount of resources to develop the research capacity or infrastructure in these 26 or 27 states. And that's how, as you all know, that NSF EPSCoR program was started. And when an NSF EPSCoR program was started, it was just in 1979 to 80, they had allocated only about $1 million. And there were 5 states, including South Carolina was one of the 5 states that received. But because of bipartisan support in the Congress, this pot of money has grown. Right now, NSF spends about anywhere from little over $200 million. And similarly, NIH created their own program, what is called, as you're all aware, it's called as the IDEA program, which together with NSF, as well as other federal agencies, together that pot has grown to about $700 to $800 million. But still, that $800 million compared to the $49 billion of research support that the federal agencies provide is really a small fraction of how much federal dollars are invested in these EPSCoR IDEA states. So if you look at in the last 10 or 11 years, like way back in 2011, federal agencies used to spend about $40 billion investing in research and development across all universities. And that has increased in the recent years to, in 2021, it increased to about $49 billion. And if you look at the distribution of those funds in non-EPSCoR states versus EPSCoR states, in 2011, 87% of that money came to the non-EPSCoR states, while only about 13% went to EPSCoR states. Over the years, the non-EPSCoR states have done slightly better. From 87%, now they're getting about 88%, while EPSCoR states have either remained flat or in fact they have dropped by 1% or so. So we are getting about 12% of the entire federal budget for research and development. And if you ask, most people will say, or people in the Congress say that, California is getting $6 to $7 billion compared to South Carolina because California population is about 40 million, or Texas is 30 million, while South Carolina is only $5 million. So therefore, they're getting more resources or more funding, right? But if you look at the population of the United States, which is about $332 million, and you look at the number of people residing in non-EPSCoR states, which is about 275 million people, and the population in EPSCoR states is about 57 million. So if you calculate per person how much federal government invests, you'll find that the per capita investment in non-EPSCoR states is $156 per person, and compare that to EPSCoR states is $103. So therefore, they're getting 1.5 times more funding per person. And so therefore, you can't use the argument that, they are more populated, that's why they're getting more resources. Oh, okay. You want to connect that, or?
I'm not sure how to do it, but let's try.
Someone didn't like my slide, I think, looks like, about the population.
I don't know what happened.
Okay.
It's showing
Is it
online?
showing? Okay.
You want to keep going then?
Okay, I'll keep going. So if the federal investment in EPSCoR states was the same as non-EPSCoR states, EPSCoR states should be receiving about $8.9 billion per year compared to the current $5.9 billion a year. That means we are losing almost $3 billion, right? And even if, of course, this is great that Chips Plus Science bill is going to increase the NSF EPSCoR funding to about 20% of the NSF budget, which will add another $1.8 billion, but it's still less than the $3 billion that we are losing every year that I feel that EPSCoR states should be receiving. And also the geographic inequality is not acceptable because, again, you've seen some of this data that the EPSCoR jurisdictions have about 50% of the HBCUs, 68% of the tribal colleges, 29% of the Hispanic serving institutions, and so on. So therefore, if you want to make sure that the federal agencies support research across all states in the US, then we have to try to make sure that we get significant share of that particular federal research funding, even in EPSCoR IDEA states. So this is clearly what Congress believes, that nation requires the talent, expertise, and research capabilities in all states in order to prepare sufficient number of scientists and engineers that remain globally competitive and support economic development. So basically, as we all agree that talent is everywhere, but opportunities are not, and therefore, for the talent in EPSCoR IDEA states to stay in their states and get education and have the opportunity to do research, we need to develop the infrastructure and nurture that culture so that we can also successfully compete in the national as well as global economy. Now, because as JD mentioned that the EPSCoR budget right now is only about 2.5% of the NSF budget. So therefore, but nonetheless, the Congress has tried to find out whether these EPSCoR programs are functioning and are they really building the capacity, making them more competitive. And I think that's asking for too much because you're not like investing in billions of dollars, like $9 billion that I'm talked about. But nonetheless, there have been many reports. In 2013, there was a NAS report. 2014, there was a STIPI report. 2017, there was a EPSCoR Congressional Service report. Then there was a 2M study and the GAO report and so on and so forth. And most of these, committees have come up with similar observations that the EPSCoR programs have clearly enhanced the nation's human capital by strengthening the research and infrastructure and by providing training to many future scientists and engineers in the states. So that's an undeniable fact. We talk about the progress that we make in track 1s, track 2s, track 4s, and so on. So these programs have had clearly major impact. But the question is, are these programs really making the EPSCoR states more competitive? So the committees also have expressed the need for rigorous quantitative assessment of the EPSCoR programs that would document their value as well. So the main question, therefore, that the Congress wants to know is, of course, are the EPSCoR programs working? And basically also, how do you measure the success of these EPSCoR programs? In our own state, South Carolina, I was a PI on the NSF Track 1, and we can talk about the progress that we made in the 5 years. We have published 256 papers, over $30 million of new research funding, 50 patent disclosures. We support over 60 faculty members, 25 postdocs, 100 PhDs, over 180 undergrad students. We recruited 17 new faculty. We got funded 2 Bridges to Doctorate program. We have had significant impact on EOD, and our research has been mentioned by the National Academy of Sciences report. So each jurisdiction clearly is making outstanding progress and adding value, and based on the EPSCoR funding that they have received in the past. But the broader question is, how do the EPSCoR states compare to non-EPSCoR states in research productivity? So we're not talking just about the impact of EPSCoR programs, but as you know, that EPSCoR jurisdictions also compete for non-EPSCoR funding. And the question is, how are the EPSCoR states doing compared to the non-EPSCoR states? Are the EPSCoR states capable of pursuing high-quality research and training if provided with additional support? That's a question that is clearly being asked by the Congress. Every time we ask for more support, they're saying, okay, we are willing to give you money, but are you able to carry out cutting-edge research, just like some of the other states like California, Massachusetts, and so on? So basically, Congress and the taxpayers are interested in knowing whether investments in EPSCoR jurisdiction are going to yield very good returns, right? And we don't blame them, that we expect that kind of an inquiry. So to address that, I have been interested in this area for many years, but in the last couple of years, I try to partner with my collaborators in academic analytics, and we try to look at the number of journal articles and books published, number of citations of journal articles, presentations at scientific conferences, number of patents generated in EPSCoR and non-EPSCoR idea states, and we try to gather data from PhD granting institutions. There were about 77 total PhD granting institutions in EPSCoR states, and there were about 300 of those PhD granting institutions in non-EPSCoR states. And we try to express the data both per faculty member productivity as well as per $1 million of federal research grants, what kind of progress that these EPSCoR and idea states versus non-EPSCoR idea states have made in the past few years. So now I'm going to move on to the actual data. And as you can see here, if you look at the research dollars or the research grants that are received by the non-EPSCoR states versus EPSCoR states, these are all competitive grants. We're not taking into consideration like large contracts that go out to the states sometimes through DoD type of contracts and all that. So these are kind of more competitive. Then you'll find that the non-EPSCoR states have received on an average about $20 billion a year. Compare that to EPSCoR states, which receive about $2 billion. So that means to say the non-EPSCoR states have received more than 10 times the money that the EPSCoR states have received. However, if you look at the total number of faculty members, clearly the non-EPSCoR states have on an average 160,000 faculty compared to the EPSCoR states. That means to say that they have almost 4 times more number of faculty. Clearly, therefore, they're going to get more funding as well as more publications and so on. So if you look at the federal research dollars, therefore, expressed as a per faculty member or per capita, then you'll find that clearly non-EPSCoR states faculty member will be receiving more federal research dollars compared to the EPSCoR states. However, if you look at the journal articles published per faculty member, then you find that in 2011, on an average, the non-EPSCoR faculty produced about 1.96 papers compared to 1.8 papers by EPSCoR faculty. But that gap seems to be narrowing from 27 to 2020. There's not much of a difference in terms of the number of publications produced per faculty member in non-EPSCoR states versus EPSCoR states. And these are the books written by faculty members. Again, there is clearly nationwide, there is a trend for decreased number of book chapters or books published by universities. And that is that you see that both in non-EPSCoR and EPSCoR states. And in this case, the non-EPSCoR states seem to be doing slightly better than the EPSCoR states. And this is, again, conference proceedings per faculty member. Again, non-EPSCoR states do better per faculty member compared to EPSCoR states. Now, as you all know, that the scientists, we measure the success or the quality of publications based on the citations. That's one of the criteria we use, right? And you find that there is a decrease that is because of not that the citations have decreased, but the way that academic analytics gathers the information. They try to see publications 2011 will naturally receive higher number of citations compared to the papers that were published in 2020. So that's the reason you're finding this decreasing slope. But nonetheless, you find that what is interesting is the non-EPSCoR and EPSCoR states seem to be narrowing their gap beyond like 2015 or 2016. And also we try to gather information about citations per journal articles. And again, there's not much of a difference when you compare non-EPSCoR versus EPSCoR states. And this is per the number of patents per faculty member. This is an area where clearly the non-EPSCoR states do so much better than the EPSCoR states. And I have some explanation for that, but we won't go into the details right now. Now, moving forward, we try to express the data as, per $1 million investment in federal research dollars, what kind of outcomes do you get? And the reason why we try to do this is because the EPSCoR states, the non-EPSCoR states were receiving almost 10 times more money than the EPSCoR states. So therefore, we wanted to find out for every dollar invested by the federal agencies, what kind of research productivity you're going to see in both EPSCoR and IDEA, EPSCoR IDEA versus non-EPSCoR non-IDEA states. And interestingly, we found that the trend was completely reversed. And I was very surprised to see this, as well as quite excited to see these results, that when you express the data per $1 million in federal funding, EPSCoR states did much better in terms of number of journal articles published, as well as book publications. The EPSCoR states did better. If you look at the conference proceedings, the EPSCoR states did better. If you look at the citations, even the EPSCoR states did better. And number of patents is the only indicator where the non-EPSCoR states did better than EPSCoR states when you express the data per $1 million. So I'm sure you're going to ask me, why do you find this difference in which the EPSCoR states seem to be doing much better when you express the data per $1 million? And the reason for that simple explanation is that the non-EPSCoR states are receiving 10 times more money than the EPSCoR states, but proportionately, they don't have 10 times more productivity when you look at journal articles, citations, book chapters, and so on. As you can see on the right side of the screen there, that if you look at the journal articles, especially from 2017 onwards, there is not much of a difference. And even to begin with in 2011, there's not much of a difference in the productivities in terms of the number of journal articles published. So there's not clearly tenfold more articles published. So that's the reason you find that when the data is expressed as per $1 million, that EPSCoR states clearly demonstrate that they are doing so much better in terms of overall research productivity. So in the interest of time, I will not go into the limitations. All of these studies clearly have a lot of limitations, and it's extremely challenging to gather all this kind of information. And so, but we have pre-published this, and I'll give you the site as well as we've sent these data for publication. It's got very good reviews, and most probably it's going to be accepted for publication. And once it's accepted for publication, I'm going to share that with you as well. But right now, these are some of the limitations that are also mentioned in the in the pre-publication as well. So some of you have heard my presentation. That's so far the data that I showed you. But I was also interested in looking at workforce development. What kind of PhDs or postdocs that EPSCoR IDEA states train compared to non-EPSCoR non-IDEA states. And basically, I was trying to focus on comparing the NSF Research Traineeship Award or the program, as well as NIH Institutional Research Training Grants. These are NRT and T32, all of you are familiar with. And you're also familiar with the fact that for EPSCoR IDEA states, it's very competitive, and so it's extremely challenging to receive these type of grants, right? So I was curious to see how many of these NRTs and T32s are funded in EPSCoR IDEA states. The reason being, these are highly prestigious. They help recruit, one of the top PhD students to join your program and things like that. So I just wanted to compare and see the number of awards made by NRTs and T32s in EPSCoR IDEA states. So I'm going to share that data with you. So if you look at the number of doctorate or PhDs received in 2021, you'll find that non-IDEA states they supported about 46,327 PhD students. Compare that to IDEA states, trained only about 5,923. Just California alone trained about 5,892, which is similar to entire combination of all the IDEA states, which together train about 5,000. So clearly they are training many more of the PhD students, the non-IDEA states compared to IDEA states. Then I try to express the data of number of students trained per $1 million. When you express the data per $1 million, you'll find that non-IDEA states train slightly less number of PhD students compared to the IDEA states. So IDEA states train about 1.26 students, and non-IDEA states train about 1 student. So the next, we try to see how many NRT PhD training grants are awarded in all states. And I found that non-EPSCoR states had 158 of these NRT, institutional training grants. Compare that to 39. And if you express the data as average number of NSF-funded NRT PhD training grants per state on an average, the non-EPSCoR states received 6 of those awards. Compare that to EPSCoR states received only 1.36. So clearly, the EPSCoR states were receiving so much less number of NRTs compared to the non-EPSCoR states. So we also looked at the NIH-funded T32, which is kind of similar to the NRT offered by NSF in 2021, and we found that there were about 1,751 of these T32s awarded to non-IDEA states. Compare that to 93 in IDEA states. And if you look at average number of NIH-funded T32s per state, non-IDEA states had 60 of these T32s, whereas IDEA states had only 4. So there's remarkable, dramatic difference between non-IDEA states versus IDEA states. And as you all know, that NIGMS, which is one of the institutes of NIH, which supports basic science, basic biomedical science research. So we try to find out how much of these T32s are funded by NIGMS, and we found that non-IDEA states received 401 of these awards. IDEA states had only 20. And if you express the data as average number of NIGMS-funded T32s per state, non-IDEA states had 13.8 of these awards. Compare that to IDEA states, only 0.9. And I also want to mention that some of the EPSCoR idea jurisdictions don't have a single NRT or T32s. So that's really worth noting. So if you want to express the data as, how many PhD students each state produce or train, and how many T32s are there to support them, then you'll find that in non-idea states, there are 46,327 PhDs that are trained, and they have 1,751 T32s. So average per non-idea states is that there is one T32 training, institutional training grant for every 26 students. Whereas if you compare the same data for idea states, you have one T32 for 64 students. So to give an analogy, there is this private school which has 26 students managed by one teacher versus another school, a public school which has 64 students in a class managed by one teacher. And you can imagine the type of training that they're going to get with the same amount of money invested, right? So there's huge disparity here in terms of the number of T32s and NRTs that are supporting these EPSCoR idea states. Again, I won't go into the limitations in the interest of time. And lastly, I have the number of PhDs employed in 2021. You find that the non-idea states almost had 60,000 postdocs employed, whereas idea states had only 3,938. But if you express the data per million, the non-idea states do better, that they train about 1.34 postdocs compared to idea states, which is about 0.84. So basically, despite all the limitations of these studies, I think there is clear data or a clear overall trend, which is very clear that EPSCoR idea states have so much less numbers of NIH-funded T32s and NSF-funded NRTs. So to summarize, basically, there is a significant disparity in federal research funding for EPSCoR versus non-EPSCoR states. I'm sure you're not surprised by that. You all are aware of that. But what is interesting is that even when you calculate it on a per capita basis, and I think there are some congressmen who try to use that particular formula, but even if you use that formula, you'll find that federal funding for EPSCoR states is so much less than non-EPSCoR states. In other words, though some of the EPSCoR states don't have large enough population, but nonetheless, when you express the data per person, then you'll find that, again, some of those states I mentioned earlier, the non-EPSCoR, non-IDEA states get more funding than the EPSCoR IDEA states. And when the impact of federal research dollars invested in research is compared between EPSCoR versus non-EPSCoR states, EPSCoR states do so much better than the non-EPSCoR states. And again, lastly, the number of NIH-funded T32s and NSF NRT grants is significantly less in EPSCoR IDEA states when compared to non-EPSCoR IDEA states. So what is the significance of our finding is that we talked about, when we were trying to advocate for, increasing the budget for EPSCoR IDEA states or EPSCoR states, and we were asking for 20% allocation of NSF funds to EPSCoR jurisdictions. There was a lot of pushback, and the pushback from the Congress was that, well, this amounts to an increase of another 1.8, almost $2 billion. And the question is, are the EPSCoR states in a position to use those funds in a way that would lead to high quality research, leads to workforce development, having an impact on innovation, having an impact on regional economy and all that. And these were, Jessica Molesworth, who works for the EPSCoR IDEA Foundation Board, who works very closely with the Congress, is to, reflect those thoughts with me and others and saying, okay, how do we address this? I think the findings that I presented to you clearly indicate that the EPSCoR and IDEA jurisdictions have the intellectual capacity to really do well despite the fact that they don't have the research infrastructure or the research capacity that you have in non-EBSCO, non-IDEA states. And in fact, when this was being debated, there was a reporter, Jeffrey Mervis, who reports for Science. He wanted to write an article, and he contacted me as well as some of you others in this audience as well. And he was questioning basically, and he wrote an article about this saying that, oh my gosh, Congress is trying to increase this budget for EBSCO IDEA states by almost 20%. And how are they going to ever use these funds? This is going to be most probably a waste of taxpayers' money. What our data shows is that no, that's not true, and we are capable of doing much better quality research despite our limited resources. And the answer to that is yes, we can do much better job with the additional resources. So lastly, I would say that innovation in all states and not in few states, that should be the key in making sure that we communicate this to the public as well as to the Congress and make sure that we continue to receive the resources that we need to grow our infrastructure and be competitive as well. So with that, I'll stop and would be happy to take any questions. I want to acknowledge some of my collaborators from USC, Ehsan, as well as Tony from Academic Analytics, that they helped me put together all of this data. So the preprint is published there, and if our article is published, the first part of it, then I would be happy to send you all as well. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Prakash. We have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, go ahead. There used to be a microphone over there, but now it's here. Oh, Gina, it's bringing. It's gonna help me. And those on Zoom, please type your questions in the chat or raise your hand. Eric is helping me to fill those questions. Go ahead.
Thanks, Prakash. Maybe I missed it, but is it possible that the non-EBSCO states have a higher number of medical schools per capita than the non-EBSCO have a higher percentage of medical schools, and maybe that's what's driving the patent papers and the number of graduate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's one of the limitations. Okay, the question was that maybe the non-EBSCO, non-IDEA states have more medical schools, and as you know, that the NIH budget is so much larger than NSF budget, and that might account for why they receive more research dollars. So that's a great question. That's one of the limitations that we have pointed out in our studies, that the way Academic Analytics collects that data is that they collect all the faculty members listed, those who are on tenure and tenure track at a given university. So that added to about 160,000 faculty members in non-EBSCO, non-IDEA states compared to, so much less, like 4,000 or 5,000 faculty members in the EBSCO IDEA states. So we have to further dissect this report or the data in terms of looking at how many of those, because clearly the faculty who are engaged in biomedical research and in sciences, for example, in STEM areas, they have access to these federal research dollars, whereas those faculty members in arts and humanities, for example, may not have the same level of support that they receive from the federal agencies. So we need to sort those things out in trying to find out how many of those faculty members in biomedical areas, how many of them were in STEM areas, and how many of them were in arts and humanities, and also try to find out, try to generate similar graphs with NIH funding, with NSF funding, DoD funding, DOE, and various types of buckets to try to see how then these data look. But it is possible, you're right, that in North Carolina, for example, UNC Chapel Hill generates by itself, I think, close to $1 billion compared to the medical schools in South Carolina generate about, maybe about $250 to $300 million of NIH funding. So.
Okay, thanks. I have a question in the chat, and then we'll move in person. How much of the NSF funding that goes to EPSCoR states come from the EPSCoR program compared to the other non-restricted programs? This is from Peter Brass.
Okay, I think there are NSF officials, but I'll try to give my numbers. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think the NSF budget is about $8 billion. I think it's going up to about $10, $11 billion. But the NSF allocation for the EPSCoR is around $200 million, $240 million, something like that. So I would say that it represents about 2.5% of the NSF budget that goes to specifically to the EPSCoR programs. But if you look at the overall allocation, that is EPSCoR as well as non-EPSCoR, going to EPSCoR states is about 12%. It's fine.
Yes. All right, go ahead. Please identify.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing this. This is very informative. But I was wondering, is there any study looking to things like funding rate in terms of EPSCoR and non-EPSCoR state? And the reason why I ask is that, is there an insight looking to review bias towards different institutions, especially competing for like highly competitive grants like MERSEC, things like this, where the review may have different opinions on things that decide the funding rate and things like this?
No, that's a great question. So clearly, I myself have experienced, bias in terms of when I apply for a grant application to either NIH. I not applied to regular NSF funding. I applied only to NSF EPSCoR programs. But when I try to compete with NIH funding, which is like non-IDEA type of funding, then I'm competing with, Johns Hopkins to Harvard to, some of the major institutions, and compare that to South Carolina. And I many a time received comments from the reviewers saying, that, oh, you don't have the proper infrastructure to carry out this type of research. And I think NIH is very sensitive about that, and I think they're trying to change the reviewers' criteria, because there was clearly one component of analysis for review was the research environment. And clearly the research environment in South Carolina or some of the EPSCoR IDEA jurisdictions can no way be compared to, the research infrastructure you have in, some of the non-EPSCoR, non-IDEA states. So there is this kind of a bias. So that's something that, the funding agencies are trying to see how they can eliminate that, to make sure that you try to review a proposal based on the quality of research and the experience of the PI, and not in terms of, resources, because those resources can be obtained through collaborations with other institutions as well. So you don't have to have those resources right then and there.
Okay, thanks. We have time for one last question. Okay, I have a quick question then. Okay. I saw that you have some limitations with faculty productivity, that you look at those that did research as well as those that didn't do research. But my question is if you were able to separate those only engaged in STEM areas.
Yeah, so the limitation is that we were not able to, we can, but in this particular study, we took, say, for example, at University of South Carolina, we have 1,000 faculty members who are tenured and tenure track, and all are expected to do research. They're expected to do at least 50% of their time doing research. So we took all of them, for example, and the same way with all the other universities. But out of those 1,000 faculty members, we did not further go into how many were in biomedical sciences, how many were in STEM, and how many were in arts and humanities, for example, science and engineering versus arts and humanities. Because as I mentioned earlier, that clearly those who are doing biomedical have more advantage because they have access to NIH, which is which has got much more funding, close to $40 billion maybe. Compare that to NSF, 10 billion, and other funding agencies. But those faculty members in arts and humanities don't have access to those type of funding. So therefore, we need to track these different buckets, biomedical, science and engineering, and arts and humanities, and then compare, as well as try to gather information or data on each of the funding agencies like NIH, NSF, DOD, DOE, USDA, and so on. So we are in the process of doing all that, but it's going to take some time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any